Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Hmm.
Yes.
Perfect.
Hmm.
Okay. So today we're gonna, for part of the session, we're gonna talk about how to write a scientific article. I don't know if you guys were like me, but the first time I wrote a paper, it was basically someone handing it to me and saying, "Why don't you write this and send me a draft?" Which is sort of a daunting experience, particularly if you're new to research. When I was in medical school, I had an anatomy and physiology professor who would liken anatomy and physiology to an elephant and sort of eating an elephant and taking it sort of bites at a time, which is in retrospect sort of an odd analogy, but it worked really well. So for those of you who are like um, in some sort of professional school or professional school bound, or really in anything that seems large and looming, this is a generally good approach, but it applies here also um, to how do you write a manuscript. So really just taking it in pieces. The first thing that I want to sort of talk about is the anatomy of a manuscript. So what parts of it are present and sort of like the staples of it. Now, when you pick a journal that you're submitting to, there may be some slight variations on it, but by and large, if you start here, there'll be minor tweaks. Um, so you have your abstract, which is just sort of your summary. Those are the things that like we all know that we submit to conferences. You have your intro, which is a brief primer to the topic, your methods, your results, and your discussion. Now, I find it helpful to think about how your readership is actually reading your manuscript. When I was in graduate school, this is the approach that I was taught to read a manuscript. So it's a little, if you see variations on it, I wouldn't be surprised, but I find that this approach is pretty helpful. Now, it's not really like a book, right? People aren't reading it start to finish. What they're actually doing is they're first reading your title to see if they're interested. But if they make it past your title, they're then interested. They'll go to your abstract to decide whether or not to spend the 10, 15, 20 minutes reading the paper. They'll then go on to your intro. And honestly, at this point, most people, if they're interested in just content, will skip to your discussion. They'll skip the methods and they'll skip the results and they'll go to your discussion. If at this point they're continuing to be interested, they'll reference back to the results. And then for those who are more interested in then like nitty gritty of what you did, they'll then go back to your methods. So they're not actually reading it in the order that you're writing it, or really even start to finish. We tend to write it this way by convention, but oftentimes this is the order in which people will read your article. That sort of lends nicely into how you should be writing it, which actually ends up being sort of the reverse of how people will read them, and really temporally how you think about a study or how you think about a project that you're working on. So you will often start with your methods. This is sort of the basics of what you did, right? So that it's natural to start here. You know the study, you know how to write the methods. This often is actually the easiest section to write when you're in the thick of a project. Um, Things to know about your methods section. You want to make sure that you write them in the order that you did them. And also, they should reflect the order in which they would appear in the results section. That will help sort of make the flow more logical. So if your analysis started with basic demographics and then moved on to a more complicated regression or some sort of model or something like that, your methods want to reflect that process as well. You want to be very precise. The goal here is to have somebody be able to pick up your paper and pick up your data set and redo what you did. But you also want to try to not repeat work. Oftentimes, we actually are in a position where we're writing many papers out of a single project, and so you may choose. You'll often see um, the methods, the more detailed methods, published elsewhere. So if you have a reference to put there or a reference to other projects that have similar methodologies, that's fine. Your goal is not to spend a ton of words here. It's to make it as clear and concise as possible. Um, the other thing, so when thinking about the anatomy specifically of your methods section, there are a couple key things that you want to make sure it includes. You want to make sure it includes a description of your site and study population, all of your data connect, not all of your data collection, but rather your data collection methods and your data analysis. Then that will lead nicely into your results section. I'm going to save a discussion on sort of style points for figures and tables for the end. But broadly talking about the results section, this may actually be the thing oftentimes, particularly if you're not a methods person, you may be handed a methods section and a results section or a list of tables and figures from your statisticians to write your paper around. Like I previously mentioned, your results should flow from your methods section. There are a couple key points where people get tripped up. Nothing should be new here from your methods section, meaning that you shouldn't present any results that weren't explained how you got to them in the methods section. People also have a hard time not interpreting results here. So if you get an output from a regression, you really just want to be reporting the number here. You don't want to be interpreting what it means or then going on to a discussion around it. You really should be saving that for your discussion section. The other thing that, particularly when I'm working with folks who are writing papers, that is most challenging is figuring out how the text of your results section and your figures go together. And ultimately, actually, your tables and your figures and your text should be complementary and not redundant. And what I mean when I say that is it might be okay to say something um, like you might want to pull out things that you want to highlight and say, this population was largely male with an average age of 45 years old, and then reference a figure or a table and say further demographics are highlighted in table one, right? Really, your text should be saved for things that you want to highlight and things that don't fit nicely into tables and figures. So if it's just a one-off statistic that doesn't need a whole table or figure by itself, that would be a good place to put it in the text. Or if it's something that is your primary outcome, you might want to highlight it in both places. But in general, you shouldn't be just regurgitating the tables and figures in the text. I next want to talk about your discussion and your conclusions. This is really the meat of your paper. You want to spend time here. Writing at this stage in the process will prove beneficial for a couple of reasons. It will flow naturally from your sort of methods and results, and it will serve as an anchor for when you write your introduction and abstract. Sort of as we talked about, because of the way people read article or the oftentimes people read articles, you want to make sure that anything that you discuss in your paper is really anchored in your discussion section. So really having concordance between your intro and your discussion is paramount. Some common pitfalls that I see people come into, even when things are published, honestly, is overstating your conclusions that your results do not support. And so, for example, if your study is about how education leads to increased education leads to increased income, your discussion section shouldn't go on to talk about how that is suggestive of improved quality of life. You didn't look at it, you didn't study it, you can't draw that conclusion. That being said, your discussion section is for talking about how your results fit into literature. So if other people have talked about that connection, or you're suggesting that perhaps it's the next step of a larger research project, it's totally appropriate to talk about those things here. But what you want to make sure is not saying that your study proves that thing if it doesn't. Really, the goal of the discussion and conclusion section is that you should be talking about the results that you just referenced above, sort of fitting it into the broader body of literature and talking about why it matters. Now, your conclusion section here may actually be part of like maybe a separately labeled thing depending on the journal you submit to, or it can be just the last paragraph of your discussion section, but ultimately it should be a clear, concise paragraph that sort of summarizes the whole paper in just a few sentences. So why it's important, what you found, and how, like, sort of next steps. It's most beneficial if you're experienced with the topic that you're writing to then go back and write your intro. Now, I will put a caveat here that if you are writing about something that you are new to or unfamiliar with, your intro section may actually be the first thing you write, way back when you do your literature search, just in terms of teaching yourself. Because really, what the intro section should walk a person through is what the problem is, what exists already, what works and what doesn't, meaning what gaps are still in the literature and how your work fits into that problem. So if you're writing on a topic that you're familiar with, it's actually easier to write your discussion first and then go back and write your intro and make sure those match. If it's something that you're less familiar with, you might actually end up writing these in tandem. But ultimately, what you don't want to do is introduce something into your introduction that you never talk about again throughout your methods, results, and discussion. On the flip side, you don't want to start talking about a topic or a theme in your discussion section that isn't at least somehow relevant to the intro that you've written. And then at this point, your abstract becomes pretty easy to write. It's just a summary of your work. And with your title, this is where you will keep or lose your reader. So just make sure that you are highlighting the most important pieces and you do it in as few words as possible, because this is the thing that's going to have somebody decide whether or not they continue reading your paper. Um, the biggest pitfall that I find folks have here is making sure it is appropriate for your intended readership. You'll often have selected a journal at this point, and you'll know who the audience for your paper is. Um, and by extension, you'll know what they're interested in. And so those are really the things that you want to pull out and highlight in the abstract. So I find this approach super helpful because it helps sort of anticipate the way a reader will read your paper, but also it just sort of flows naturally in the temporal way that we do research. So to go back to figures and tables, so these are often easiest to build first, right? You're at a stage where you've completed or nearly completed your study, you have your analysis done. Um, you want to build your figures and tables so that you can write your methods and results around these. As we talked about, they shouldn't be redundant with the text of your results section. So you really want to think hard about how you want to use the space, particularly because it's often limited depending on the journal that you're choosing to submit to. A couple style points that will help you be successful. Don't clutter. Um, so this is extracted from a basic science article, and the content around it honestly doesn't really like the context of what they're studying doesn't really matter. But I want you to look at this and think of yourself as a reader. Ultimately, the point of a figure is that you should take 1 or 2 minutes to be able to glean a significant amount of information and data from the study that you did. So looking at this, even if you had the context of whatever genes they were measuring, you can see that in the middle of this, everything gets muddled. You don't know which lines go where. You don't really know what any of the symbols mean. This text or this figure, excuse me, does not stand alone from the text. And truthfully, they should. Somebody should be able to look at a figure and say, oh, this is people's blood pressure over time. And you shouldn't need the text to be able to know that. So instead, you may choose actually, if you don't have a figure limitation, to separate these things and just make it more clear. And at least I know that now, without even any context, I have group one on the left here that has an increasing outcome measure And on the right, I have a group of folks or a group of outcome measures that are sort of standard or decreasing over time. And I can tell all of that without even knowing the content of the article. Now, you may find that you're only like you're given a certain limitation on figures, and at that point, you may elect to choose the style of figure, though, rather than doing a scatter plot or something like that. You may choose to do a histogram or a pie chart or something like that that is more amenable to the number of figures that you have available to you. You want to make it legible. So the publishers will publish what you give them. And ultimately, this is not an eye chart for your readers. You want to make sure that if you have the ability to, that you make your text clear, you remove any extraneous lines, and just sort of like basic design principles here. So just to summarize, when we're talking about writing a manuscript, I want you just to walk away with a handful of things. Like you remember nothing. Hopefully, this group of guiding principles will make your life easier when you're writing a paper. So remember that it is written in the reverse order of a person who's typically reading your manuscript. Remember your author guidelines. If you have the luxury of knowing where you're submitting to, writing it within those author guidelines is going to be very, very helpful. That way, you're not finding yourself at the end of the day uh, trying to make six figures into two because um, that's what the journal suggested. If you are not in a position where you know which journal you're submitting to, the guideline, the suggestion that I would give you would be to actually pick a journal that is predominant in the field that you are publishing to. So if you are publishing a pediatric study, that may be pediatrics. If you are publishing in emergency medicine, that may be the Annals of Emergency Medicine. If you're publishing in cardiology, it might be resuscitation or the one of the AHA cardiology journals. But pick something big, like a big journal, and model it after that because oftentimes many other journals will flow from there and at least be in concordance. And just really remember that you are building your story. The easiest place to start is with your methods and results, as I mentioned, because that's sort of the part of your story that's done. You know that part. You just finished doing that because that's where you're at actually chronologically in your research study. Build the story into your discussion. Make sure that it lines up with your intro. Ultimately, what you should be able to do is read your introductory paragraph, get a basic foundation for what's happening, and then go into the discussion and continue reading and glean information from there. I like to think of these two things in tandem, that if my reader walked away after just reading the intro and the discussion, they would have learned the majority of what I wanted them to learn from my paper and really the meat and the heart of my research. At that point, you just want to go back and make sure everything is summarized in the abstract and that somebody who is flipping through 100 abstracts trying to figure out what's relevant and what's not gets all the information they need from that abstract, or the critical information at least. We'll sort of provide these to you as well, but there are some really good resources if you find yourself running into trouble. The BMJ Author Hub actually has little articles and videos about, like, they're 5 to 10 minutes about various different sections that you may write. So if you find yourself sticking on a particular question or a particular part of the paper, um, they're a very good resource. I will also say that they have some resources on things like responding to reviewer comments and things like that that come later in the stages as well. So if you're finding yourself stuck there, they have a really good resource. Like I mentioned, we'll send these two links out, but these two articles are very brief, sort of 10,000-foot views on how to write a scientific paper that have some really nice um, teaching points and guidelines as well. So if you're just looking for a how do I do this, and you need something written down or you'd like something just sort of to structure yourself by, these two articles are really good. Anyone have any questions? I know that that was a bit of a whirlwind, but really the goal is to give you guys just sort of an overview of when someone hands you sort of the task of writing a paper, how you go about doing that and just sort of orienting yourself so that it doesn't become this behemoth of a task. And if you write it really from intro to discussion in that order, it will end up being a bit more disjointed than you intend it to be. Right. If no one has any questions, I will hand it over to Sydney.
Hi, everybody. How are you today?
Really good. Thanks, Sydney. I'm super excited to hear what you have to talk about. I've recently been myself learning about open source things. I'm excited to hear about that and the dissemination piece that you're going to talk about.
hmm Um, yeah, so thank you. I wanted to say, I really appreciated your presentation, Rama. It was very helpful. And in fact, I'm still learning some of these lessons and these key takeaways as well. Um, the presentation that I was planning on giving today is actually focused on the NIH public access policy, and I think that's going to be a little bit advanced for the session today, given what we just talked about. So, as a good segue, I think it would be helpful to take this time and to hear from the group in sort of a roundtable discussion format your experiences working on manuscripts. So I see we have a couple of folks on the line, Josh and Rafiq, Hannah, who have recently worked with the Accrue team on various manuscripts. And so I think it'd be helpful from you guys to hear what your personal experience has been like with manuscript writing, and then to share some of the key takeaways and lessons that you've learned or pitfalls with your peers. And then um, we can go about it that way so everybody can get on the same page and take some solid um, steps and experiences with them.
Yeah, Sydney, I really like your idea. Can we stop the recording at this point, perhaps to have like a more open discussion?
Yeah, that sounds great.